Second Timothy, maybe-ish.
Maybe pseudepigraphy? I mean, somebody writing in his name?
Yeah,
Maybe.
but
I'm just curious.
I'm
the
not gonna
difference.
say it though.
Yeah, okay.
Also, by the way, Corinthians is probably 4 letters. But
Yeah, yeah.
we're not gonna get into that. Okay, and also, something more, which is much richer in the later things. Let's begin with now Philippians. So Philippians 3:10. This is a very important theological topic, and this is where we're gonna end. So Philippians 3:10, and then Colossians 2:12-13. Then Ephesians 2:4-7. And 2 Timothy 2:11-12.
And these Catholics go through their Bible.
Yes. Let's hear what these things have to say. Philippians.
Right?
Nope.
Okay. Philippians, Colossians 2,
Yeah, no, it goes.
Oh, you read for me?
No.
Okay.
Okay, we're ready. So once again, these are not the same kinds of words appearing later, but these are different parts of the tradition. So Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Timothy. So this is like the whole versions of Paul. And the topic here is participation. Okay, Philippians.
To know him in the power of his resurrection, and the sharing of his sufferings, by being conformed to his death.
Yes, participation in Christ. That's how it's described in Philippians. All right, Colossians.
Colossians 12 and 13, or 2, 12, 13. You were buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God, who raised him from the dead. And even when you were dead, transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he brought you to life along with you, having forgiven us all our transgressions.
All right. And my hand-waving argument is that now this is part of a different Pauline tradition.
Okay.
Colossians, which is the first tradition, and not Paul.
Right.
This is a different. So once again, I'm just saying.
I don't know what you mean.
Okay, right. Why am I doing this? Because the Pauline scholars make distinctions in Paul, whether who wrote what of the Pauline literature. The autographs, the ones that Paul definitely wrote, are the ones up there, like 1 Thessalonians, Romans. These are big Paul. Then there's little Paul, which are Paul-ish, but introduce other aspects, like Colossians, that we just heard from, and Ephesians, that we're about to hear from. And then there's a whole different kind of Paul, which are these last little letters of Paul, of like 1st and 2nd Timothy, which are probably not Paul, and to share and have differences of form. And that part of the argument I am not making today because I cannot, because we are running out of time. But what I am trying to do is introduce you to what the New Testament has to say about Jesus.
So basically,
And I'm doing it through Paul, because Paul is where everything else is at. So the first part of my argument was, Paul, where the Gospels take their stuff from. Paul, where in fact everyone takes Christ from. Paul, the apostle of Christ. That's the argument.
and so with these traditions, it's like, first tradition, this stuff is Paul. Second tradition, most of this stuff is Paul.
Actually, like, it's Paul, then the first tradition, then the second tradition. So it's Paul, and then those, like
Okay.
Paul maybe.
Paul,
then
first tradition is mostly Paul, and then third tradition, probably not Paul.
these are Pauline scriptures, exactly. And that's the way to think of it. And I'm trying, that's the one kind of hypothesis that I am proffering today to you, in terms of what may or may not be true. But this is also something that Pauline scholars are very, very competently sure of these days. This is modern scripture scholarship. Yes.
So is that book right there, the one that you've been pointing at that you had from your professor, is that, would we, oh, it's not in English.
No,
Is it, or is there an English translation?
no, and there probably won't be for another 20 years, because English-speaking theology is usually about 20 years behind what's going on in Rome.
Wow.
Instead of the other way around?
Yeah.
How much does that cost?
According to who?
Especially these days. Especially these days. Don't trust English-speaking or German-speaking theologians because they're probably just not Catholic. Yes.
There's gotta be an English resource that makes
Yes.
the same
And you want
arguments.
to look for books by a guy named Scott Brodeur. Brodeur. He is Brodeur. Brodeur.
Okay, thank you.
He was also one of my professors. He's a great guy. But
But
he's,
Father, even these second traditions, Timothy's and Titus are still pre-gospel.
yes, all of these are
So
pre-gospel.
we're still
Wait,
talking roughly the same
Because
thing.
I never heard of this stuff before, and it's
Yeah.
great.
I know, right? Yeah, yeah.
So the first Paul is First Thessalonians?
First Christians.
So like Paul himself, these are what would be autographs. We know that Paul wrote these. This is like the whole history of scripture scholarship coming to bear on this. First Thessalonians is definitely Paul. It's also definitely the first one.
So are the books of the Bible, the Gospels, they have not been pinned yet? Is that what you're saying? Like when First Thessalonians came out?
That's right.
Okay, so then it was
They,
just
they,
oral
and they
tradition?
wouldn't be written for another 30 years.
So these Thessalonians, they're in church and they're listening to this letter from Paul.
Yeah.
All they have is this letter being read to them from Paul.
Yeah, and it's the
and
first
then
thing written.
oral
It's the
tradition
very
ever.
first thing written ever about Christ. Yes.
First Thessalonians is the first letter in Christian, experiment in Christian.
Can you imagine being there in the way that you just set that up? Being in church, which is like, hanging out with friends, and thinking about that.
Well, it's kind of like that one where Jesus reads Isaiah and said, "This gospel's fulfilled in your hearing," or "This is fulfilled in your." It's kind of like that.
You're right, it changes the paradigm totally. Like here, we have this new thing called our own scriptures. Whoa. And then of course it wasn't, it's probably not thought of as scripture then. I mean, this is a whole other kind of a thing in Paul, but like, did he write other things too that we don't have? Probably. I'm not gonna say yes or no on that one, but it's interesting. Okay, but let's go back to this. Okay, we did Philippians, we hear Colossians. We
Yeah.
did, we
Yeah.
heard Colossians, Ephesians.
But God, who is rich in mercy because of the great love he had for us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, brought us to life with Christ. By grace you have been saved.
Yes, yes. Participation in the resurrection of Christ. Okay, it's just a wonderful thing. But this is no longer Paul himself, maybe. Okay, and then 2 Timothy.
This saying is trustworthy. If we have died with him, we shall live with him. If we persevere, we shall also reign with him. But if we deny him, he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he will remain faithful, for he cannot deny himself.
Yes, yes, yes. One of the things which is really typical of the later writings, and also much more similar to the writings of the John epistles, James, is that it's blocky. So first of all, the word is to be believed, as it says in the Greek. Pistis ho logos. Then it was like, thing. Read it again. This is so typical of the later epistolary work. Read it again.
This saying is trustworthy. If we have died with him, we shall also live with him. If we persevere, we shall also reign with him. But if we deny him, he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself.
Right.
Cause and effect.
Cause and effect. Cause, effect.
If this-
Cause, effect. Does that sound like a Hebrew writing?
No.
That sounds Greek to me, actually.
So what's the inference?
So what I'm saying there is also part of this Pauline thing, is that this is now no longer Paul in his personality. His personality has changed. He's talking about the same thing that we heard in Philippians. Let's hear Philippians, please. I think you had Philippians, 3:10.
Sorry. I
We
didn't
moved
message.
on.
Okay, let's go back to Colossians then.
Okay,
To-
so on Colossians 10 and 13.
Yeah. This is-
Giving thanks to the Father who has made you fit, wait a minute, I'm right.
2, 12, 13.
2. Okay, here we go. Wrong, turn the page. So, you were buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God, who raised him from the dead. And even when you were dead in transgressions and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, he brought you to life along with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions.
Right, so Jewish.
Similar.
Yeah.
Similar, but with Jewish themes. And I don't want to like focus on the circumcision or not, because that's really not part of it. But I'm just saying that that is a much softer kind of thing than what we're getting in 2 Timothy, which you would never hear earlier on. You would never hear something like that in the earlier epistles.
Because it's harsh.
That's syntax, because it's simple, because it's so clear, because it's speaking like a philosopher would and not like Paul necessarily. But I don't want you to focus on this thing that's Paul or not Paul, but I want you to be able to realize that it comes through generations. And the first generation are these first and second traditions. The generation after this is the Gospels.
Okay.
And so this class was supposed to be New Testament Christology. This is New Testament Christology. It's crazy. It's not my favorite subject.
Really? What's your favorite subject?
Actual Christology, which we're going to talk about next time. Okay, let's see. I want to stop now. So, by the way, there's so much to do here because it's just so much fun, because Paul is wonderful. But we have to move on. And I want to see if the copies I asked to be made have been made for you. I'll be right back. Think of any questions.
Wow, this is fun.